My name is Jeff Appenzeller and I'm on staff here at Eco Justice Center. Welcome to another installment of our Fall Festival How-To series. And as I was thinking about this, as those words how-to, and it's exactly how-to what? Well, here at EcoJ, one of our missions is to both live and teach people how to live sustainably and how to have a right relationship with the plants, the animals, and the people around us. So that's what all these video series are about. So for my part of this series today, I want to show you how to have a right relationship with the food that you throw away. In a typical household, you clean a broccoli, you dice some carrots, and those parts that we don't eat go into the trash. That trash goes to the landfill, it putrefies and becomes something that nobody wants anything to do with, and in your mind it has just gone away and everything is okay. In terms of the earth, that's not okay. That's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to do anything good. And if it was in nature, nature would say, hey, thank you for the gift. I got something I can do with that. That's what vermiculture, which is just a fancy German speak for worm composting, that's what vermiculture does. Vermiculture seeks to do a couple of things. Take those food scraps that you have in your kitchen, reuse them, compost them quickly. Now, if you're a conscientious human being and you have the ability, the facility to have a compost pile, you would take some of those food scraps that can be composted, and instead of throwing it in the garbage, they will go into your compost pile. But here in Wisconsin, especially when things freeze to a halt in the wintertime, that can take a year, sometimes 2 years for that stuff to fully break down so that you can reuse it. The end product of vermiculture is worm compost. And the reason that a person might choose to do worm composting is that there is something, there's another life force inside of this compost. Now, we think we humans are sharing our earth with only plants, animals, and us, but there are actually other important living things in here. There are molds, and there are bacterias, and there are funguses that are needed to help our plants and our animals and our humans not only survive, but thrive. Studies have shown that E. coli, Salmonella, and Listeria are absent in soils that have a healthy worm population. So something about their activity actually removes these pathogens from our environment. So this is vermiculture. This is the product of old food that we had in our school cafeteria. It's a product of food and any packaging material that I have at home. Instead of throwing it into the recycle bin, some of that will go into my worm compost. So when it comes planting time, I will have a bucket of my worm compost, and I also use my eggshells because calcium is very, very important for plants to set their fruit. Tomato and pepper and squash end rot happens because there's not enough calcium. So I calcium fortify instead of throwing my eggshells into the garbage. Some throw them right into the garden, which is a good thing to do. I throw mine into some of my worm compost. I mix it in, and in with my tomatoes and a little bit of organic fertilizer, and my pepper seedlings go a couple handfuls of this, and I believe that is the thing to do. And while if you lived in an apartment or in a housing complex that maybe have some kind of weird rules, you might not be able to have a compost pile, and that's understandable. You can certainly have a vermiculture bin. A vermiculture bin is an environment that can sustain the activity and promote the life of worms, and not just any worms. The worms you see after a rainy day are earthworms. Earthworms, in one sense, in their way, are good for the soil in your yard, but they are devastating to the soil in a forest floor. Now, these worms are not native to America. They would not certainly survive in our environment in Wisconsin because they would freeze. This is a red wiggler. So worms, like us, we like things to be moist, but we don't like to be wet. Worms are the same way. So this has gotten a little wet because it was neglected. And so the environment isn't ideal, but these worms can survive with a lot of neglect. So in your worm bin, what you will see is worms. In a happy worm bin, you will see undigested material. Usually seed husks take a long time to decompose. They last in there for years, but there's no harm in that. And if it's a happy worm bin, you will see these little sesame seed sized worm casings. And that's your future livestock. If you were a worm farmer, you would have a special screen that would screen these out. Mechanics of a worm, any kind of worm bin, whether it's 2 buckets that nest inside each other this size very well, 5-gallon buckets. This is about ideal because you can have enough worms to get the job done. But this one, because I do not have a basement, and since they are a tropical creature, these come from Africa, these are African red wigglers, they cannot survive in our environment. Mine stay in my family room under an end table, much to my wife's chagrin. So she's not totally down with having worms in our family room, but she's also not against it because she knows the necessity of having a right relationship with our planet. This was an activity that I did with the school children, both in my classrooms and in other classrooms. And in this homeschooling, lockdown environment, once again, this is something that has that your young people can have hands-on experience with. They can do science with this, and they can learn about decomposition and about other life forms. And this is just perfectly suited for those young hands that have a lot of energy and they love to touch stuff. Because when I would bring the worms out into the first grade classroom, it was all hands on deck excitement because they actually tried to name all 2,000 in here. They believed they could distinguish them. So a worm bin needs to be ventilated. The living creatures in here, the bacteria and the worms, they need oxygen. So it's just a matter of taking a drill and a small size drill bit, usually about 1/8 of an inch, and making sure that you have adequate ventilation. So a lid needs to be well ventilated, and you need to have two different compartments. The inner compartment has vent holes that are drilled in all the way around the outside to allow some of the water out. Some people go as far as actually cutting big strips and putting screen. The more ventilation you can give this, the happier and healthier it will be. And then this bin that I'm holding now has holes drilled in the bottom for drainage. This is called worm tea. And this worm tea is full of beneficial microbes, beneficial for plants. So if I wanted to use this, I would dilute it about 5-to-1 or even as dilute as 10-to-1. I could put it in a sprayer, and if I spray my plants with it, that's called foliar feeding. I can feed my plants through their foliage. Not only that, but it inhibits pathogens that can infect the plant. So not only does it feed them, but it's also somewhat of an immune enhancer. Now that my worms have done their job, and I look at this, and I can't see any food residue left in there. It's all nice and crumbly, hopefully not too wet, hopefully not too dry, just moist to the touch. The upper layers of this is fine. Now I need to harvest the worm castings. I need to harvest the worms so I can put them back to work, so they can make more generations of worms, so that they can continue to make worm compost for me. Another thing that this worm compost does is it intensifies the amount of helpful bacteria that are in your garden soil. Just like we humans have a microbiome that we're just learning about in our guts, the soil also has a healthy microbiome. And the reason you might choose worm compost over regular compost is worm compost is super fortified in those essential bacteria, molds, and funguses that plants need in order to take nutrients from the soil to begin with. So to help your plants thrive instead of just survive is one of our end goals. So I need to harvest this, and in order to harvest it, I have to be able to screen it, to sift it out, and I have to be able to dry it out. So this can be as many as a several day process. It doesn't require a lot of time but it requires a little bit of attention. So what I like to do is to take my bin, and I'm going to cover it with newspaper only because it helps the compost not stick to the plastic sheet that I'm going to put over top of here. So I'm going to take a garbage bag that I cut the bottom off and I turned it into a square. I'm going to put that over my bin. I'm going to put my lid back on. This is the part that got the kids all excited. Now you don't need, I'm going to put it in this pan just because it'll be handier for me to move around later. You can just dump this onto your garage floor. Or if you know the weather's going to be dry, dump it onto your driveway. Mine went into the school hallway, which a lot of people furrowed their eyebrows at, but they didn't understand what it was doing there. That it was actually doing good instead of harm. So I'm going to upend this. Worms are wondering what is going on. And I can see that a lot of the eggshells and sediments have settled to the bottom, and this is very muddy and wet. So what I will do now is I will leave this sit out in the sun, or sit out on my garage floor, or sit on my basement floor. Basement is not ideal, of course, because it's damp down there, but I need this to dry out. When this dries out, such that it's nice and crumbly, when it achieves a texture like this finished compost, then it's ready to harvest. So what will happen is as these worms are exposed to the light, they will burrow down. Often when I'm truly ready to harvest, I will put some food on top before I tip it upside down so that the food is on the bottom. So they would all burrow down to that food and there would be a big mass of worms right down in the middle of this. Then what you do is I would take my hand and I would just scrape off those top layers one day. Put that in a bucket. What do you do when it's dark? Don't ever leave your lid off your bin, because these worms will be on the ceiling, they'll be in your pillowcase, they'll be in your wash, they will be everywhere. They are adventuresome little creatures. So the way you do that is you create a force field. Worms don't like light, obviously, because it dries them out. So I will take a very low wattage LED light in a little holder and I'll shine it on there if I don't want to put it away. And that's what I'm going to do with this, because I don't want to put it away wet. Once I start hitting worms and moist compost, then I stop and let it dry out a little more. Eventually I will get it down to where I have just a real small mass and I have a bucket of wonderful worm cascades. So normally I would be scraping the top layer of that compost pile that I have in my garage or in my basement, or much to my wife's chagrin, on the living room floor, when she gets over it. And this is an actual worm composting mesh sieve that I bought, I think, for $5. I made this one out of a little hardware cloth. This works just as well. The mesh is a little on the large side, but if you're harvesting a worm bin that's got a lot of big chunks in it, this is the size you want. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shake this around, and you can see the black gold, baby. That is gold. I'm watching all those little pieces of organic material that are going to feed my garden. I'm looking at all that wonderful worm compost. I can see a lot of worm eggs, egg cases in there. There are anywhere from 5 to 20 worms inside that little egg case. So when this is sitting in my pantry or waiting to be used, a lot of times I'll look at it and it'll have a lot of little worms in it. You'll never get them all out, and some just have to be sent into your garden. So eventually you set that down. I have my worms back. I've got the stuff that needs to be digested back, and that's going to go right back into my active worm bin. Now, how do you create the beginning product of this? How do you get this all started? I'm going to reuse this bin, even though normally I would hose all of this out, I would run it through a strainer, and I would just dump it either into my garden or back into the bin that I'm about to set up. So we're going to pretend I did all that this is a nice clean bin. I drilled the holes in the sides for oxygen, in the bottom for drainage. And then I create their bedding. Here's once again where I start my right relationship with the planet. I don't put this in my recycle bin, even though that is what you should do with it if you're not worm composting. I take a lot of my cardboard and newspaper, and I shred that up. Now, just like leaves will mat, you don't want whole leaves in your garden. You want this stuff to have some structure. You just don't want it all laying flat in there, because when you wet it, it's all just going to mat down and become an impermeable layer. So I'm going to dump all this, that me and a couple of young hands sitting watching a half hour of TV. We sat and we just took the box and some newspaper, anything that basically is made of paperboard in your house, cereal boxes, toilet paper rolls, paper towel rolls, all that stuff. Instead of going to you don't know where, you can put it to good use. And now that I've got the bedding in place, I need to inoculate this. Remember, worm composting, what you're trying to do is enhance the number of helpful bacteria, molds, and funguses. So you need to have a source, you need to have an initial inoculation. So you can go to a garden center or your own compost pile. So this is EcoJ compost. Because it's been outside composting, this is probably at least a year-old compost. This has all those beneficial microorganisms in it. So I've got that in there. Basically, they like the same kind of soil that seeds like to grow in. Not wet, just moist. So I'm going to wet this down. If I over wet it, I can add dry material. And certainly some of that water is draining out of the drain holes. I'm just going to stir that around. I need to let this mature for a few days, because what's going to happen, just like with the compost pile, this is going to heat up now. All that excess heat is not good for the little worms in there. So I'm going to put the cap on this, and I would let it sit to the side for a while. And I'm going to add some of these worms in there, and they're going to do what they do. So I've added worms in there. Now I need to feed them. I need to reuse some of those scraps. And now I got to know what to put in my worm bin and what not to put in my worm bin. So think about those soft tissues, your inner lip and your eyes. What would you be cutting on your cutting board in your kitchen that would cause your eyes to burn? Well, onions, spicy peppers, salsa, citrus fruit. Those astringent, those hot things, worms don't like, because their entire body is like the inside of your eyelid. So you don't want to put those kind of things in. Just about any kind of green is good for worms. Things that worms can't digest, they can't digest fats. So any kind of meats, any kind of dairy products will putrefy in there, and it will smell. Another thing to make sure that you don't add to your worm bin is native worms. Native worms can be carrying their own viruses and their own pathogens that your African worms aren't used to. The rule of thumb is this. You should know when you start your worm bin out, weigh the weight of worms that you're putting in there, and a half of what they weigh you can put in per day. So they can eat half their weight per day. So if I put in a pound of worms, I can put in a half a pound. Now, worms don't have teeth of their own. They will eventually work this stuff down, but if I have something like my chard here, well, once again, you got busy little hands that need to spend their energy. Come over here, young'un. Take this and break this up, throw it in a worm bin. Now, you want to make them feel even cooler, even a bigger part of it. Give them something that's safe for them to handle, that they can help you with. Once again, you're grabbing that kid's interest, you're grabbing their help, and you're increasing their experiences in the world. So I'm gonna take this stem, for example. This is a salad knife. Now this is sharp enough to cut through any greens you have. Maybe not this red curry squash, but most stuff that you're preparing for dinner, this can cut through, but it doesn't cut skin readily. So get those little hands, give them the salad knife, and say, hey, young'un, cut this stuff up for the worms a little bit. I'm going to ask my camera person. I'm going to put her on the line. Camera person, I used to eat a banana and I would just throw it into my garden, thinking, okay, I'm going to add that stuff into the soil. How long does this last when I throw it into my garden?
6 months.
2 years.
Oh my gosh.
So this is going to last in the environment for 2 years. Not that that's a bad thing. It will decompose. In my worm bin, this is going to be gone in 3 days. So that's how we accelerate and use those microscopic workers and those worms. Now another important aspect of this is I don't want to let that stuff just sit on top, because even though we can't see it, there are molds on these things. Those molds will continue to flourish and grow. So I need to cover this stuff up so that those worms can actually eat those molds. Otherwise those molds will grow. This looks like a worm bin in action. I can see food, I can see worms moving around. Usually when you pull the lid off, there will be worms scooting around the top, crawling on the lid. I will put this back in here. Back into my capture container. I don't want it too hot. I don't want it too cold. They will not survive outside. They will not survive in your unheated garage. I do not have a basement, so they have to stay in my living space somewhere. But I can tuck this in a corner. I can tuck it next to my water heater, under an end table, and I know I'm doing the right thing for my plants. And in the end, I'm going to do the right thing for my garden. Oh yeah, enjoy your worm composting.